Everybody, and welcome to CDE Virtual. Today, my guest is Arvind Panagariya, Professor of Economics, Professor of Political Economy at Columbia University, former Chief Economist of the Asian Development Bank, author of over 15 books, and for nearly 3 years, the first Vice Chairman of the Indian Prime Minister's think tank, NITI Aayog, and therefore a Cabinet Minister in the Modi government 2015 to 2018. Arvind, it's a great privilege to have you back with CDE after your visit to South Africa 9 years ago. Thank you for your time. Sorry, you're muted. You're muted? We can't, yeah. Arvind, you're muted. There.
Thank you, Anne. I feel really privileged to be invited to speak at this prestigious platform and in front of this august audience. Glad to be back with you.
Great. Well, thank you. So this year, India celebrates 75 years of independence. So it's a good time to talk about some of the central debates in that country about their political economy and issues that resonate so strongly with discussions in South Africa. Now, Arvind, in 2013, you said that the key lesson to learn from India is the importance of growth. There are many people in this country and elsewhere who argue that faster growth in unequal countries like India and South Africa only benefits the rich. They dismiss what they call trickle-down economics because supposedly it doesn't work, or it works far, far too slowly to reduce poverty. What is your view, based on the facts from India, which has experienced such tremendous growth rates in the last 30 years?
Okay, so this is, of course, a very perennial sort of question. There has been a debate on this issue for a very long time. And especially in India, of course, and part of it was because of the very fact that in the early years, growth was not good enough to reduce poverty in India. So we also actually went through a long phase in which we felt that somehow growth was not going to do it. But, once growth, actually rapid growth has happened in India. So first of all, what is India's experience here? Once rapid growth began to happen, certainly poverty came down quite significantly. So, last 30 years, but unfortunately, the expenditure surveys which allow us to measure poverty, the last one happened in 2011 in India, and it hasn't happened since then. But we do have some evidence, therefore, for about 20 years from early 1990s to 2011. And there, certainly, the poverty roughly got cut in half. If I give you the numbers, 45% approximately in 93. By 2011, for the same poverty line, poverty had come down to about 22%. So it got cut in half. Reason why, for a country like India, to some degree, even South Africa, growth is important is that, look, in the rich countries, there is enough income that you can possibly redistribute. And we saw some of this redistribution happen recently during COVID era, both in the United States and European Union. But for poor countries, there's just not enough income. And especially, when Nehru started in India in the 1950s, even he would say that, look, right now, if we rely on redistribution, all we can do is to redistribute poverty. There was just not enough income to redistribute. Also, politically, I think in a growing economy, redistribution becomes a lot easier. So if you can grow rapidly, resources are becoming available, government revenues are rising, and those can then be used to do redistribution. And India certainly, during this high growth phase also did redistribution. Some of the anti-poverty programs, which is the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme that was started, some of the food security, which involves selling food at highly subsidized prices to the poor. Those programs could be funded and carried out. So redistribution also became a little easier because of growth. One last point, I really think, this is something I'd not seen even till I'd written this book, Why Growth Matters, which is what we discussed 9 years ago on this platform, only that we were live at that time. I was in South Africa there. Is that, looking back on India's experience, rapid growth of the kind that countries like South Korea and Taiwan and Singapore were able to generate in the 60s, 70s, and 80s simply cannot be generated without inclusion. I think that was the experience of India. India went straight into very heavy industries, right? So your income was low, savings rate was only 7%. So you tried to invest in these heavy industries. 3 or 4 steel mills basically took away all your savings, all your investments went there. They didn't generate much employment, much jobs. So the rest of the population remained completely outside. This is what we economists used to call, development economists used to call dualistic development, that, you're creating these pockets of development, but nobody else is included in that process of development. So in a way, my thinking now is that, if you're really going to get 8, 9, 10% kind of growth without inclusion of those at the bottom rung, particularly in a country where labor is the abundant factor of production, where, lots of workers, not enough capital, you just can't do rapid growth without their inclusion. So it is, in fact, we conventionally have talked about growth for inclusion, but actually we also need to talk about inclusion for growth. And that is where I think, the early experience of India really did not recognize that inclusion was essential to achieve high rates of growth.
Great, that's a really important point. I'm going to come back to 2 of those points a bit further on. You've said that poverty reduction should take precedence over reducing inequality, and that countries like India should focus much more on providing equality of opportunities for poorer people. Let me quote you. You said that when we think of our historic economic policies, we in India worried too much about inequality, which led to policy mistakes. For rich countries, inequality is a bigger issue. For India, removal of poverty has much more importance than the reduction of inequality. Why are you arguing this?
Okay, so again, as I mentioned, one of the things that politically redistribution to the poor has greater acceptance. When you're already a relatively poor country begin to grow more rapidly, and incomes rise, revenues rise, redistribution to the poor is certainly a lot easier. That's part of the argument there. But also, people themselves really, ultimately care a lot more about the absolute levels of income and their own well-being than of the, country as a whole, meaning, therefore, the equality issue. And I like to use this example from India, that we got 2 of these states at the extreme. The state of Bihar, which has a very massive poverty, the per capita incomes are extremely low. It is the state with the lowest per capita income out of the 28 states currently in India. At the other extreme, we got Kerala, which is one of the highest per capita income states. It's not the highest, but one of the highest. Now, Bihar, because everybody is poor, inequality is very low. It's one of the lowest. Kerala, by contrast, because it receives so much of the remittances from outside migrants, roughly every 3rd household gets something in remittances. Kerala is therefore, for expenditure purposes, very unequal, one of the most unequal states, but has high per capita income, high per capita expenditure. Now, Where do you think people migrate from to where? It's the people from Bihar who migrate to Kerala, just showing that, what they are really attracted by is the higher prospects of higher per capita incomes and expenditures, then repelled by the greater inequality in Kerala. And so that's the essential argument that, look, even when people themselves look at it, they react more to their own well-being than that of the nation as a whole. Not inequality can matter when it is within your immediate social context, and there I think some of the redistribution can be quite counterproductive, meaning that in India, for example, to reduce inequality, rural urban, let's say, there are these programs to redistribute to the farmers, and this is done indirectly through, for example, government buying the surplus of the surplus grain of the farmers at a price which is much higher than the market price. Now, what happens there? The small farmers who have no more than an acre of land, sometimes even half an acre of land, they have no surplus actually to bring to the market. They don't benefit from that. It's the larger farmers, who got farms which are at least something like, 15, 20, 25 acres or larger. They benefit. Now, if you think about it, the inequality between the poor farmers and the rich farmers actually rises as a result. And that is the inequality because it's in the immediate social context. That actually makes the farmers, the poorer farmers, even more jealous that, look, the government is doing it, but not for me, but for these richer farmers. So in fact, this can turn it quite counterproductive when you're trying to address inequality in this way.
Why do you think poverty has not declined as rapidly in India as in, say, South Korea and Taiwan in the 60s or China in the last 3 decades? Why has India not been able to sustain high growth rates of the other Asian countries?
Right. Okay, so this is a very good question, actually, and that's a fact. Factually speaking, it's very interesting that if we look at South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and later China, every one of these 4 countries practically eliminated the extreme poverty, what we might call abject poverty, without almost any redistributive programs. They, in the early years, later on, of course, the health insurance, etc., kicked in. But that was much later. If you look in the 60s, 70s, till even 80s, actually, in Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, you don't see any kind of significant redistribution of income happening. But growth is so rapid. Growth is so rapid, it's about 9-10% on average for almost 3 decades. Now, how does this growth happen? And this is where the earlier point I was making, that, look, inclusion for growth. So this growth process itself was very inclusive in the case of all of these countries. In what way? South Korea, I'll give you some, we can use South Korea as an example, but it's true of China as well as true of Taiwan, same thing. You start out, about 1965 or 1960, let's say, almost about 65% of Korean workforce is in agriculture. 65% of workforce is in agriculture. By 1990, that has fallen below 20%. So 40 to 45 percentage point workforce has moved out of agriculture into industry and services. That's the inclusion, right? You've got a lot of workers, got a lot of labor, you need to employ that. You have successful labor intensive industries. They are able to export in the global marketplace. And so they can expand, they can take advantage of economies of scale. All of that goes on. The workforce moves out of agriculture where the average value added is low into these activities where average value added is high. And that kind of also generates side-by-side growth. During this period, while industry and services are absorbing such a vast volume of workforce, 45 percentage point of the workforce, leaving out of agriculture into coming into industry and services. You will think that with so many workers coming in, wages would not rise. but actually productivity is rising so rapidly that real wages during this period rise continuously for about 25 to 30 years, 9 to 10% every year. And that is kind of the transformation. And that, of course, is something that in the Indian context, Indian case did not happen. Even though, I mean, the earlier period, of course, there was no inclusion. There was zero inclusion. Workforce practically, you know, these heavy industries, steel, aluminum, and all sorts of machinery industries, which is what India promoted in those early decades. They employed hardly any workforce, you know, very tiny part of the workforce. It's a very elitist kind of model of development, no inclusion. I think after the reforms that started in 1991, clearly the economy was opened up and inclusion began to happen. And the share of the workforce in agriculture did decline. So something like, you know, if you look at early 1990s, about 58, 59% of the workforce was still in agriculture. That fell to about, you know, by 2018 or so, that fell to about something like 42, 43%. So, you know, some 15, 16 percentage point workforce did move out of agriculture into industry and services. And so some inclusion did happen. And that also did help actually growth to kick up, you know, growth, which used to be about between 3 and 4%, jumped to about something close to about 7.5% during this period. And that is what then helped, you know, and in the Indian case, of course, because of the democratic political setup, redistribution also happened simultaneously. So as revenues became available, as I mentioned, these social expenditure programs aimed at providing some sort of employment to the poor at some low wages. It's, you know, it's not very high real wage at which the employment is provided, but it is better than what they would otherwise do. Some redistribution through very highly subsidized food. Practically, you know, it's free 5 kilograms per person per month under this food security program is given practically free, because it's like 2 rupees per kilogram. So that's hardly any price, you know. So so that is how I think the two were different, and so that also explains that, you know, the inclusion still has not been of the order that we saw in South Korea and Taiwan and China in India. So that roughly is the way to see it.
Right. Now, when I think of India today, a very big challenge for any government, for the Modi government today, is to create jobs. As you have said, around 8 to 9 million young people join the labor market every year. Now, in your view, this can only be done if large companies are encouraged to invest in labor-intensive sectors like clothing, footwear, electronics, and electrical goods manufacturing. Why, in your view, is this the only route to more jobs, or the most important route? Can you create enough jobs through these kinds of labor-intensive industries? And what prevents India from doing this? What's holding this up, in your view?
Okay, so first of all, you know, it need not be industry alone. So when I say labor-intensive, it could be manufacturing or it could be services. And the Indian case now, you know, because of its history, is that overall services have become more important in terms of at least employment. Traditionally, you know, manufacturing in India has not been very successful, although this is what, you know, the earlier policies promoted. I mean, starting with Nehru and afterwards. Focus was very much on industrialization, manufacturing and all, but it has never done extremely well. So the employment share, you know, if you look at the share of manufacturing in employment or share of industry in employment, it has been around between 11 and 13% for the last almost 30 years. It is services which have really increased their share, you know, so a lot of this movement out of agriculture that I mentioned, you know, workforce in agriculture declining from something like 58, 59% to 42, 43%. That movement has been largely into services. Most of these jobs are not very highly paid, high paid jobs in India, but they certainly do better than what you would do in agriculture. So in the Indian case now, even at the earlier stage of development, still services are important. So at least there are some services, which can create jobs, reasonable jobs: construction, transportation, tourism. So these are some of the services also which could contribute. So now, in general, we can ask the question, why is it essential for the labor-intensive industries to be the sources of jobs? What is true of India really is that, look, vast part of the workforce is still not very highly skilled. Outside view that you get, when you see it, look from outside into India, you see the IT industry, you even see some of the machinery industry being very successful. You look at the Ambani's petroleum refinery, these gigantic, highly capital intensive or skilled labor intensive, successful industries. But this is not, where the workforce is. If you look at IT industry, maximum it employs maybe 3 million, maybe 4 million people, I think more than that. Total workforce of India is somewhere close to 500 million. And you say it has been growing every year because of the demography. Even if the birth rate has not dropped close to the replacement level, because of demography, each year you do have probably 8-9 million is an overstatement, but certainly some 4, 5, 6 million are entering every year. So you have that issue. Besides that, actually, there is the problem, what I call the problem of underemployment, and really, I think that's a bigger problem in my view. That it's not so much if you look at all the employment surveys, which now we are doing consistently annually now, and that unemployment rate generally hovers around 4%, 4.5%. It's not a very high unemployment, but because everybody is poor, you got to make your ends meet, you got to do something. So they're not not doing anything, but it's simply that what they are doing is very low productivity employment, and it is this workforce who is not so super skilled that needs to be given better jobs. And you can't bring them, the IT cannot do that. The machinery sector cannot do it. Pharmaceuticals cannot do it. You need industries like apparel, footwear, furniture industry, a lot of kitchenware, the kinds of things that China had been exporting in very large volumes, still does actually, but particularly in the 1980s, 1990s, and even early 2000s. Those are the industries which, for limited capital, now remember that, for India, even capital, the savings rate is about 30% of the GDP currently. But given the GDP level itself, it's not gigantic volume of savings. It is decent level of savings. But if you end up investing these savings into very highly capital intensive industries like petroleum refining or machinery industry, then you are not creating jobs per unit of capital, which will be sufficient to absorb such a large workforce in a reasonable amount of time. So India still needs to succeed in these industries. It is a bit, some of the reasons why it has not done well are known, but maybe there are some unknowns as well. The known reasons are that labor, first, of course, India had this uniquely Indian policy of small scale industries reservation. What that meant was that all the products that are labor intensive, the apparel, footwear, the furniture, kitchenware, all the things that require very little capital but can employ a lot of labor to operate efficiently, these were restricted to be very small enterprises which could not invest more than $1 million worth of capital. Even million is a stretch actually, but for most part, they were well below $1 million. Now, such small enterprises can never succeed in the global marketplace. And so that was one factor initially. Till 2005, this reservation remained in India. Finally, by 2005, this reservation was ended. but still the labor laws were very inflexible. And so that, for example, if you had 100 workers in the work in a particular enterprise, 100 or more, then you simply had, under no circumstances could you lay off your workers. Well, that of course also made the workers unwilling to work. And so if you had more than 100 workers, you simply could not efficiently deliver, you could not work. And so that still hasn't changed. The parliament has changed a lot to some degree, but it has not been implemented yet. So that still remains a bit of a problem. Probably there are other things like infrastructure. Maybe the work culture is also taking time to change. Ultimately, workers also have to be, if you look at Chinese work culture and even compare it to the American work culture, very different. Chinese workers really very quickly kind of beat out the American workers when working side by side. And there was this movie called American Factory. There was actually a documentary called American Factory in Netflix. So if you haven't seen, I'd recommend to people, see what the difference is in the work cultures and all. So there are those factors as well. But I think that will ultimately have to change. That is changing, but perhaps it has changed faster. I think those are the factors, both why India needs to do it, why it has not been able to do it, and what needs to be done. I think the labor laws need to be implemented rapidly. That's really very important. And infrastructure needs to be continuously built. One of the problems in India also, you got to connect because the traditional model was not trade related. It was very anti-trade model. And so a lot of the historical locations of industries have been not near the coast. They've been far away from the coast. But then your infrastructure is not good enough to bring the products to the ports. And the ports don't function as well. What takes in Singapore 5 hours would take in India 5 days. So and these, this is a world of just-in-time delivery. You can't, function if you can't meet your deadlines. You lose your orders very quickly. So these are some of the remaining things which will need to be sorted out.
One of the surprising things to me is that Bangladesh has managed to get such a burgeoning textile industry, and yet in many ways it must have similar labor laws to India. Is that very different, or did they just ignore them? What is your view of that? It has been
very good question. I think, I mean, given the historical ties between this part of the region, you would think exactly that Bangladesh would have the same laws, but it did not. And it had actually reformed its labor laws way earlier, and particularly actually in the export processing zones, which is where the garments industry started, the apparel industry. They had very flexible labor laws actually. So Bangladesh was well ahead of India, even in policy terms. And it is no surprise that apparel industry succeeded in Bangladesh, whereas it's still struggling in India. So that's a very good question. If you look also, another neighbor, Sri Lanka actually does a lot better. On average, you look at the firm size, the Bangladeshi firms and Singapore and Sri Lankan firms in apparel industry on average are way larger than what they are in India. So, the fact that they are linked into the global economy and they actually did do something good to their labor laws, particularly Bangladesh. I'm less familiar with the laws in Sri Lanka, but Bangladesh, I know that, their labor laws have been much more flexible. And they also, the government, sees this, though the government might be similarly inefficient as the Indian government in Bangladesh, but they see this, that, that this is their big employer because, the population workforce in Bangladesh is much smaller. And you can see that this apparel industry employs a lot more workers as a proportion of total workforce than it is the case in India. So they really pay special attention to that industry. Vietnam is another very kind of successful example of very successful country in recent times. They also have been, I mean, export-wise, the success they have achieved is completely phenomenal, over the last 10 years.
But we had read, to come back to India, we had read that some of the states were starting to introduce labor market reform in order to attract labor-intensive factories. But you're saying that the lag between change, the laws might change, but actually implementing it is taking a long time, or is that what's happening?
No, I think everywhere there is a bit of a lag between the enactment of the laws and the response happening. But in India, it gets even longer because the bureaucracy moves slowly, particularly in areas like these, where states also have to actually make rules and regulation, the secondary regulation, because in India, labor laws is what we call the concurrent subject. So central government has laws and state governments also do it. So when the central government changes a law, rules and regulations have to be written both by the central government and the state governments. And so that kind of slows it down dramatically already. But then for the industry to also recognize that the laws have been changed, it takes time. I mean, in India, a good example I like to give is that Indian economic reform started in 1991. But the really great large growth momentum of about 7 to 8%, that arrived as late as 2003. And so you had reforms for 11, 12 years. Some immediate growth effect happened of about 1.5 percentage points. But the bigger one, so from 4, we went to about 6%, let's say a little below 6% in the first 12, 13 years of reforms. But then to go to 8, actually, it was not till 2003. So there is this lag, at least, observationally, not how it is divided between the implementation of laws, entrepreneurs reacting to that change, all that we don't know. We don't have enough information, but certainly we see this very large lag. No, so some patience is required. I mean,
it's often hard.
Yes.
But let me dig deeper on this issue of labor-intensive manufacturing, because it's very important for South Africa in our view. You are saying that there are big opportunities for India to get into much more labor-intensive factory and manufacturing. There are a lot of people who say, oh, it's too late for India or South Africa or any other developing country to adopt strategies attracting factories, local or foreign investors, producing low-skilled goods for the global market. And they say that, hasn't automation and a retreat from globalization made it too hard or too late for this kind of approach to industrialization and job creation? But you seem to be arguing differently. What would you answer those people?
Okay, so yes, I get that quite a lot. And there is a good answer to that. Now, there's a little difference, as you know, between South Africa and India, which is that South Africa is a higher income country. And that probably smaller. Has to do, sorry?
The population's a little bit smaller than your nearly 1.4 billion.
Yes, no, that is true, population, but that makes the problem less difficult. I mean, the lower population makes the problem less difficult because only a few enterprises have to succeed in the global marketplace. But the other problem makes it a little harder, that because the average incomes are already high, and if the wages are actually set at that level, then South Africans' competitiveness would not be as good. India is in that respect, it's not a high wage country. Even per capita income in India is still a little above $2,000 per year at exchange rate, not at purchasing power parity. At exchange rate, it's about a little more than $2,000 a year. So it's still relatively low. Wages are relatively low. So that very important factor for success in apparel industry or footwear industry is still there. So issue, therefore, is what you are saying here is that can one succeed in the global marketplace? Well, look, I mean, apparel exports, the last I checked, which was about maybe 2 years, 3 years ago, the global market was still $800 billion, just the apparel. Then you got footwear. You also got some textiles, which use some labor. You got furniture. There are a lot of other industries. Even there are labor-intensive activities even within some of the electronics industry. A lot of the assembly industry where you need assembly, so that's a separate point that I'll come to in a second, actually. But first, first off, there is market. The other thing is that China is exiting some of these labor-intensive sectors, and we have seen actually in the last 10 years alone. For example, Vietnam expand its exports very, very rapidly. From something like 90 billion in 2010-11, it has gone to some like 285 billion last year. So it's just phenomenal expansion. Some of it may be spurious because maybe there is some avoidance of sanctions by China, and so there's some transshipment going from China to Vietnam and Vietnam too. But even before sanctions, you see very rapid expansion of exports in Vietnam. So it's sanctions probably accelerated a little bit in the last 4 or 5 years, but certainly it was on a very high expanding trajectory well before the sanctions. So they've been able to do it. That's one thing, So therefore, also do some little simple calculations. You got a population of 8 billion people on the planet. Even if you allow for 2 shirts per person, that's 16 billion shirts to be produced. Somebody has got to manufacture those. Think of the trousers then, even if it's just 2 pairs of trousers per person, that's 16 million trousers. So you got, this is not ending. So then the issue comes in about automation, that could automation really threaten this sort of thing? Now, this phenomenon of what we are calling today automation, what I would say is not just automation, but what it manifests itself is that less and less labor per unit of manufacturing and more capital per unit of manufacturing. So increasing capital to labor ratio in manufacturing across the board. That is a phenomenon that has been ongoing. Like the amount of labor you required in apparel industry, let's say in the 1960s, was a lot more per shirt or per pair of trousers than it is today. There's no question some of the processes within the apparel manufacturing have been mechanized. So that phenomenon has been ongoing. So what we call automation today really has been an ongoing phenomenon. But what happens is that it is true that all of these industries are becoming less and less labor intensive, but the scale has been rising. So the incomes, because this whole mechanization process or increasing capital per unit of labor, that process is also accompanied by increasing productivity, and that raises incomes. And as incomes rise, the demand rises. So therefore, the clothing market has dramatically expanded today. Also, with this kind of rising capital labor ratio, what has also happened is that the labor, the wages in many of the countries have gone up too much. So they're not doing these activities. I mean, there was a time, in this till the 80s, we know this MFA, multi-fiber agreement, existed because US was trying to save its own labor intensive activities, largely the apparel industry. It's gone. There is no apparel industry in the United States, so everything is imported into the United States. I won't, put it past the realm of possible that in another 10, 15 years, China will not be producing much of its apparel either. So export market could still expand much more. So that's the second. Now, automation by per se, it requires 2 things to happen. First, it has to become technologically feasible, and then it has to be financially, commercially viable. Now, if you take apparel industry, for example, today there is not even at the innovation level, there is no credible process which allows the robots to do stitching. When it comes to holding two pieces of cloth and stitch it, human hands are the only ones that are able to do it so far. I mean, some progress has been made, and some examples are given and all, but nothing which is which is credibly credible innovation. So that's one. But in addition, ultimately that has to become also competitive against the more labor-intensive process. Can it beat it? Now there, one very nice example of the Adidas factory. So Adidas actually, tried to do this automation and brought one factory in Germany and one in the United States, Atlanta, which was highly automated. And they practically, except for putting the shoelaces in, robots still could not do it, but the rest of it, they were able to mechanize it. So the German factory was in 2015, Atlanta, United States, 2016. But by 2020, they had decided to actually move the two factories to China. They just couldn't compete there. These factories together were producing only about 1 million pairs of shoes, and Adidas produces something like 160 million pairs of shoes. So the remaining 159 million pairs were still being produced in China and other East Asian locations. So that experiment to bring actually manufacturing for Adidas, and the CEO, there were interviews of the CEO of Adidas, and he was saying that it's completely unrealistic to think that manufacturing can come back to Europe or the United States. So I think one last point actually, which is that with the technological change and the revolution in both transportation and information technology, what is happening is that the production process is being now split more and more finely. So take iPhone for instance. iPhone altogether has something like 1,600 parts. These are produced in 43 different countries by 200 different firms, right? So that is the fine kind of process splitting that has happened. Once the production process is split, then you can pick up in every product, you can pick up the activity which is most labor intensive, and you specialize in that. So even if apparel begins to become partially capital intensive, at least there will be some labor intensive activities within the apparel industry. And what you do is, rather than try to do value added in such a way that you produce the entire product in your own house or in your own country. I mean, that is the obsession sometimes, I see in India, certainly, that, try to produce all of the mobile phone in India. No, that's the wrong thing to do, because if you try to do that, you will never be competitive. Do the activity in which your cost advantage exists and capture the entire global marketplace in that particular activity. So like China, as I said, iPhone, China only assembles them. And in these all Apple devices, the Chinese value added is maybe 10% or so, but it is 10% in 100 million, 200 million such devices. So total value added becomes extremely large, and total employment that generates becomes very large. So that is the set of arguments that make the labor-intensive manufacturing still attractive.
Well, pretty comprehensive answer to that argument. Thank you very much. Really interesting. I want to try and get 3 more questions in before we have to close. The first is that, contrary to many people, you argue that for India's future prosperity and more inclusive policies, that small is not beautiful. And you touched on this earlier, but you're saying that India has far too many of its jobs in small economic units. Can you sort of briefly give us a feel of why you're arguing this for urban and rural India?
Okay. Yeah, no, I think this is, to me, that's the heart of the problem for India, actually. Take first of all, agriculture, farming. Now, I mean, if one does the comparison with the United States or any one of the countries, even Korea or I'm less familiar with South African farming, but United Kingdom, wherever, farms are tiny in general. But about half of Indian farms, 48% to be exact, probably they are now half. This is last agricultural census which took place in 2015, but a new agricultural census will come in, and I'm pretty sure it will be more than half now. But so 48% of Indian farms are less than half hectare. I mean, it's less than half hectare, right? So, and the average size of these farms, now when they said that half of them, 48% are less than half hectare, some are only quarter hectare, some are even less than quarter hectare. So when you do the averaging there of all these farms, about 0.23 hectare is the average size of these farms. Now, nobody with a family of 5 can make a living on such a small farm. In most countries, you would not even define that sort of piece of land as a farm. It's not, it's a kitchen garden, if you wish, so that's the agriculture, and then even when you go to, if you define it, let's say small farms are defined in India, the Indian definition is 2 hectares. So if you take farms of 2 hectare or smaller, that's about 85% of India's farms. So it really is very small. You're employing them in these tiny pieces of land, which of course says that, look, they need to be taken out of those farms and some decent jobs have to be given them in industry and manufacturing, or industry and services. That's where you need to create good jobs for them, and therefore also they reduce the labor to land ratio, because that's how you will increase productivity in agriculture. If you look at productivity in agriculture, particularly per worker, it's very low in India. Even per acre of land, it's low, but when you compare it per person, it's extremely low value added. So that's the agriculture. Industry. Now, to give you an idea, so already I told you farm, so about 43% of the workforce is in agriculture, farming. Now, remaining, where are they? Well, less than 10%, so about, let's say 10% of India's workforce is employed in enterprises. So this 10% of all workforce, of which 40 to 43% is in agriculture. So 10% only is in enterprises that have 20 or more workers. Now, even 20 workers is not a very large enterprise, but unfortunately, I don't have finer division of this data, final classification of the data. So this household survey collects only 20 or more. So that's less than 10%. The remainder are all in enterprises which have less than 20 workers. And very large part of this, very large, by which I mean, so that leaves, about, let's say 45% of the workforce. Easily about 30% of this workforce is in enterprises, which is less than 10 workers. And very large part of that is in these, mom and pop kind of enterprises, meaning that there are no workers, no formal employment provided in those. It's the people who own the enterprise. They're the one, they're the ones who are working at it. So these are called in India, the own account enterprises. This is the, these are your own, basically, no formal, no workers, outside workers are employed. So this is the basically map of the employment of the Indian workforce. So they're all, employment concentrated in these very small enterprises. And I'll come in a second, why that is not so good. But just to round off this evidence, you look at India's schools, lots of tiny schools. So even, about 12-13% of Indian schools, primary, these are elementary schools, so up to 8th grade. About 12-13% have less than 20 students, which means 3 or 4 students per class. And even if you take the size to about 100, so schools with less than 100 students are about 2/3 of public schools. So I'm talking of public schools here. So in public schools, about 2/3 of the public schools have less than 100 students, on average 45 students. Now, even with 45 students, what kind of class are you going to have? If there are 5 or 8 grades, they get divided into classes of 6, 7, 8. So these are pedagogically problematic. Students don't learn unless they got another 20 students in the class. And of course, financially, it is very, very costly. Colleges are the same problem. Lots of tiny colleges. Population itself, if you look at, you got about 35% or so, maybe at the most 40% in urban areas, remaining 60% in these habitations, which are very, 4,000, 5,000 at the most. Some, of course, have only 500 people living in habitation. So, I mean, the smallness problem is very serious, and this matters because, if you want to do infrastructure, bring electricity, bring water, bring education, this all becomes very costly. So the infrastructure building becomes much more of a challenge. Okay, so but for industry, why this matters very much? What happens is that if you look, for example, it's not that small enterprises by definition cannot succeed. That's not the point. Point is that if the small enterprises are the dominant form of enterprises, so that vast majority of so India is about 85% of workforce in industry. Whatever is employment in industry, 85% of it is in in enterprises with less than 50 workers. Now, if this is the dominant form of enterprise, the productivity in these small enterprises is going to be extremely low. I mean, that's an empirical regularity. So I do the comparison of China and India. About 75% of Chinese workforce in industry, even in 2005, was in medium and large enterprises. In India, 85% was in small and only 15% was in medium and large. So what that translates into is very low productivity per worker in the small enterprises in India. But it's pretty decent, actually. In China, the productivity in small enterprises is about 60% of what it is in the large enterprises. In India, it's only 20% of what it is in the large enterprises. What happens is that your ecosystem is in India is defined pretty much, the particularly labor market ecosystem is defined by the small enterprises, where the norm is easygoing, not enough work to do, underemployment and all. So that defines your ecosystem. And so there's not enough tightness in the labor market. In China, all these small enterprises are working side by side with this massive kind of 75% of the workforce, which is in medium and large enterprises, is highly productive. They got to compete with those. And so ultimately, it's the ecosystem is defined by is dominated by the medium and large enterprises. So small are also much more productive. So it's not like, small will not succeed, but it's simply that when the vast swath of your workforce is in these small enterprises, and these small enterprises obviously are not going to connect to the global marketplace. They are serving the local population and all. So, by nature, they're not so competitive and all. And so also the economy is not therefore connected into the global marketplace. Whereas Chinese economy comes to be connected in a big way because of these very large enterprises being very successful. And so that changes the expectations out of the small enterprises as well. So I think that is why you need some decent size enterprises in sufficiently large volume, so that the small would have to work as hard as well.
Great. That's really interesting in terms of the debates in South Africa. I want to move to a different question. The central government in India has 53 cabinet ministers for a population close to 1.4 billion. But in your view, this large number of ministries is detrimental to governance and to development. Can you tell us why you think that?
Yeah, no, I think that this brings in a lot of problems. And, first of all, when you have these ministries for such a large number of line products. So there is a Ministry for Textiles, the Ministry of Fertilizers, Ministry for Chemicals, Ministry for Steel, Ministry for Heavy Industry, you name it. Then there is one ministry for what is called the micro, small, and medium enterprises. There is an IT ministry. There is electronics ministry. Now, what happens is that in a system like that, every industry finds a place where it can go and lobby for its narrow interests. And so these ministries become the focal points of lobbying for the industry. And what often is in the interest of the industry is not necessarily in the interest of, or even actually what is in the interest of the existing enterprises within the industry is may not be even in the interest of the entire industry, let alone in the interest of the nation. So that's one problem that happens. So, I argue that, look, amalgamate these in, create one industry which deals with industries, regardless of which product, and one ministry which deals with services. So that at least at the ministry level, you don't respond to these narrow interests. Because if it is single ministry, then if textile guys come in, you can say that, well, I do for you, but what about I have to do it for IT guys, and then I have to do it for the steel guys, I have to do for the chemicals and fertilizers, etc. Right? So it diffuses. The ministry has a way, has something to go by. But if you're a textile ministry, then what else are you going to do if you're not going to represent the interests of the textile industry? So that is one issue. Also, I think the ministries also, as you know, in India has a very large number of public sector enterprises. So the government runs these enterprises. Now, grossly inefficient enterprises. Many of them are what we call the sick enterprises, which are producing nothing, but they are still there. They're supported through the taxpayer money. Now, obviously, you want to close the sick enterprises and you want to privatize more and more enterprises, unless it is something like defense related or something like that. Then it's different. The government can run those. But it's not something that government should be running textile firms or running steel firms and so forth. But in India, they are there. So when the ministries are there, they are also opposed to privatization. So as the chief of NITI Aayog, I sort of started this process of privatization. In 2016, I began. And often from outside, I used to hear that it is a problem of the workers, that the workers will go on strike and all. But I discovered, much to my kind of horror, that it was not so much the workers. Workers hardly came to oppose. It was almost always the ministries and the people who were the CEOs of those companies. So this privatization process also gets this big pushback, from the ministries, because the thing is that there is a financial issue here, that when they want to do something which cannot go onto the government budget, that can go onto the budget of the enterprise. And so everybody wants to keep their enterprises so that they can continue with the expenditures that the government accounting system would actually not allow you to do. So there is that also. Then in general, when you also got these public enterprises, steel industry, public enterprises in steel are not doing well. They want protection. Well, the protection is not just for then the government enterprises, it also becomes available to the private enterprises. So a lot of the policy and regulation actually, unnecessary kind of policy and regulation comes into play just because you're trying to save your public enterprises. So there are a lot of these issues that come together, from having these multiple ministries, where so many of the important specific products or sectors have their own ministries. So that is my kind of argument, that why we should reduce and club many of these ministries into single.
Great, thank you. I'm going to sneak in one last question because it's your favorite topic. You're a strong proponent of free trade, and you've said that in your experience, no nation has succeeded or has successfully transformed on the basis of import substitution. If you restrict imports, you also restrict exports. There's a big debate in South Africa about increased localization, not because the companies are more competitive, but almost this is your national duty to buy local. Can you very briefly give us your thoughts on why import substitution doesn't really work and is not a good idea for a developing country?
Yeah, you see, every government wants to produce some successes, show that my policy succeeded. And import substitution is the easiest way to show it. You raise the, the demand is there because imports are coming in. So you know that the demand is there. Stop the imports. Somebody locally will produce that, no matter how inefficient they may be, but they will supply it. So it's very attractive. And I can understand, the governments need to do that, but if you do it in one or two sectors, that's okay. I think you'll not create so much damage. But if you're trying to do it on the very large scale, that across the board, it'll never succeed, because ultimately what happens is that the capital, every country has scarce capital. So when you encourage these import competing industries, capital comes into those industries, but it comes into those industries from somewhere. Somebody else would have otherwise used it, and that somebody else is export industries. So you're really, as you try to favor the import competing industries through this protection, you are disfavoring, you're punishing your export industries. Now, remember that your export industries are the ones in which your cost of production relative to your competitors abroad is the lowest. That is why you're able to beat them out. Whereas import competing, the products that you're importing them because your cost of producing these products is higher than the cost of production abroad. So what you are doing is really, produce more of what you are good at and export those, and not produce those that you are not so good at and import those. That's what is, but through protection, you're reversing that entire process. So the logic is that, and then of course you are also disengaging from a very large competitive market where, if you competed there in that market, you will learn a lot more. It's like, just think about if South Africa stopped playing cricket, test cricket, in 10 years time, what will happen to the cricket team? Ultimately, because the team plays the world-class cricket, it is constantly on its toes to beat the Indian team or beat the Australian team or the British team. Everybody is working very, very hard. You learn from their techniques, they learn from your techniques as well, of course, but you're constantly strategizing. It's the same thing with, if you're operating only in the domestic market, ultimately, the domestic customer has no choice. So they will buy your product, but that's not going to produce the best of the products. I grew up actually in a very highly protected India. I remember what the products were. Our running joke used to be that our fountain pens were more like fountains and not pens. Because ink would flow so heavily that so there's something called the blotting paper. So we always used to keep this blotting paper, which will absorb the extra ink after you had written on the paper. So and with two cars we had, Ambassador and Fiat. In 1980, it was the same model that we were buying in 1950s and 60s. No improvement was done. So, there is no substitute for that. Empirically, you can see, you can look at, who has succeeded. Every country that has succeeded, from South Korea to Taiwan to Hong Kong to Singapore to China to ultimately it's India also on that path. At least, Vietnam is coming, Bangladesh is coming. They are all successful countries are ones which have chosen to actually be a member of the global marketplace.
Arvind Panagariya, thank you very much. This has been a fantastic hour. I've certainly learned a lot. And well, just on your last point, if you think how big the domestic market is in India, and yet you're still saying the wrong approach is to protect yourself from outside competition, I think that's very persuasive. Thank you very much, everybody. This is the end of our conversation today. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Arvind. Been fantastic.
Thank you, Ann. Thanks very much for having me.
Great.